Hello, I'm Philip Luck, Scholl Chair in International Business and Economics Program Director here at CSIS. Today we'll be talking about a casualty of the U.S.-China trade war, and that is U.S. farmers. Agriculture is a common casualty of trade negotiation or trade spats because of both its political saliency and its ease of being turned on and off as a sales market because it's a commodity. China is an enormous market for much of U.S. agriculture, including beef, soybeans, and other products, and we've seen a marked reduction in these products, exports to China, since the trade war began earlier this year in the second part of the Trump administration. We've seen a 73% drop, or more than $6.8 billion decline in exports to China, and that is vastly impacting farmers across the nation. Importantly, this is not the only impact on farmers. In the 2018 trade war between China and the United States, this was the main impact. However, this time around, the trade war is much wider. So in addition to these reductions in exports to the Chinese market, farmers are also facing higher prices for fertilizer, steel, and machinery, lower supply of laborers, and depressed domestic prices because of larger boycotts of agricultural goods. So this is in some sense a bit of a perfect storm for U.S. agriculture. You can see on this graph, if we look at changes from the beginning of the year, January 2025, total agricultural exports to China are down a whopping 73%, again about $6.8 billion. That is largely concentrated in two really key markets of exports to China, including U.S. exports of beef, down 95%, and U.S. exports of soybeans, down 100%. We actually haven't seen orders of soybeans from China since May. If we look at the market for beef here, you can see that as a classic example of a commoditized market, China has simply shifted its imports away from the United States here in blue, down 94%, and to Australia in red, up 54%. This is again a huge challenge we have in trade negotiations or trade spats. Not only are these products incredibly politically salient, but there's an easy ability to export market differently, which can have really large effects on the domestic constituencies. Where are those domestic constituencies? Well, we can see Nebraska, Kansas, and Texas all export annually more than $1 billion a year of beef to China. Again, much of this is dried up as a result of the fact that China has let export licenses lapse for hundreds of facilities that process U.S. beef. So until those export licenses are reapproved, we should see no change in this trade pattern overall. We see a very similar and also troubling pattern in U.S. soybean production or sales. So what we have in blue here is the weekly sales of soybeans for your average year between 2020 and 2024. And in red, we have weekly sales of soybeans through 2025. I should also note that we would normally have a few more data points here, but the government shutdown has made it so we don't have new data coming in. Now, one thing you'll note is that there's huge seasonality or spikes across this period. The U.S. harvest of soybeans and the sales are very concentrated. And we are now into the period where you would normally see significant rises in soybean sales to China, but we are seeing no changes. If you look more at the sort of seasonality over the years, you can see the two biggest producers in the globe of soybeans, Brazil and the United States, basically create sort of a cyclicality or a sine and cosine, you might say. So when Brazil exports an enormous amount due to their harvest cycle, the U.S. produces less because that's when we're planting and not harvesting. And when the United States is harvesting in September through November, that's when soybean exports to China increase and those in Brazil decrease. Now this is important for two reasons. One, we should not overstate any sort of changes we see that map the cyclicality, but also very importantly, we are now in the smack dab middle of our U.S. harvest. So while we don't see exports to China, silos are getting full and we need to be able to sell those products. One thing that farmers are very concerned about is a repeat of 2018. This was a trade war in 2018. You can see before and after 2018, you have that normal cyclicality. You have when we export a lot, Brazil exports a little, and so on and so forth. We basically lost an entire harvest cycle because of the trade dispute. We're still in the early part of that dispute or cycle for this year, but unless this is resolved soon, there's high concerns among the soybean industry that this is what we're in for, and this will cost the industry billions and billions of dollars. As I mentioned before, unlike 2018, the decrease in demand for soybeans is not the only thing that farmers are facing. They're also facing higher prices of inputs, steel, aluminum, fertilizer, machinery, all things that are hit by tariffs that make the cost of producing and harvesting these crops higher. Also, immigration policy changes have made it so that there's less of a supply of new laborers who, again, the farm labor does rely largely on immigrant labor. This, plus the fact that other markets are also drying up due to consumer boycotts or other measures, means that there's a huge oversupply domestically, again, lowering prices. So in some sense, this is a bit, as I mentioned, of a perfect storm for U.S. agriculture. There's talk now about a bailout to farmers, which again may be necessary to sort of offset these costs. But one other thing we can learn from the 2018 experience was total revenue from tariffs in 2018 was about $80 billion. These were tariffs on the PRC. The amount that we bailed out farmers was almost exactly the same, about $80 billion. So as we think about the costs of the tariff regime this administration is putting out, not only should we think about the tariffs that our consumers are paying, but also the fact that some of that revenue is going to have to be paid out to others to bail them out as well. So in some sense, we're going to be paying these tariffs twice. Again, we'll follow this as this evolves, and hopefully we'll find a way to resolve these issues in the near future, and we can go back to commerce and agriculture. Thank you so much. See you again soon.